YouTube channel on a whim in 2016 after taking my wife on a date night to go see Lady Ghostbusters. And if you don't know what the internet conversation was about that movie in 2016, if you liked it, it meant you were a moron. And if you didn't like it, it's because you were a sexist. And I was like, that's weird. What if I tried to have like a normal opinion on the movie? And so I posted a video on the internet sharing my thoughts on it. And less than 3 years later, that became a new career for me. If you're like my mother, you have no idea how someone makes money on YouTube. And if you have kids under the age of 18, you know that every child wants to be a YouTuber when they grow up. So I have the dream of every child in America right now. As he mentioned, I'm a Rotten Tomatoes certified critic, which is really cool because I've been reading Rotten Tomatoes for over 20 years. And so it's like surreal to me to like see my own face on there. And sometimes like on the feeds for like digital stores for movies, they'll like have quotes from me and I'll be like, that's me. I'm one of those people now. And so it's just really cool to like kind of live the dream. I do something for a living, which I would and did do for free for years. But that's the romanticized version of my story. In 2 years, I turned my hobby into a full-time career. If you've ever heard anyone's real story about success, it's always messier than that. See, when I went on that date with my wife to go see Lady Ghostbusters, that was about rebuilding trust. Because I was in rehab, I was unemployed because of my addiction issues, and I just tried to start a movie webpage for 18 years before that. None of it went anywhere. And so to understand my story, you really got to go all the way back to my childhood. And I had a very tumultuous childhood. I didn't know it at the time. When you're a child, you don't really know the difference between what's normal and what's not. So I just knew what was. And what was for me was that my father was a functional alcoholic. He'd get drunk out of his mind every night, and then he'd be productive at work. So everyone at work thought he was just like this fun, cool guy, but he was very unstable at home. My sister and I, we used to tell daddy stories growing up, all of the crazy antics that he did. And I remember in my early 20s, I'd started working with teenagers. And one day I was telling one of these quirky stories about the time my dad grabbed a 2x4 and he hit my sister with it, and then he hit me with it because we needed a new spanking spoon. And I thought it was like a funny story. And I realized like, oh, no one's laughing. And as I was saying it, I realized if any one of my students told me this exact same story, I'd be legally obligated to report it to the police because it was a story of abuse. Yeah. And so much of my childhood was just chaos. In fact, my dad drank himself to death by the time I was 20. So for me, movies were my escape. Movies were this place of these exciting stories, these fantasies, where I would just go into that world, so much so that when I was in middle school and we got our trial disc for AOL, where we got 5 hours of free internet, 5 whole hours. I used all 5 hours to go to every movie webpage I could find, which, in 1993, there was like 3 of them. So it didn't mean a whole lot, but I used all my time looking at movies on the internet, and then quickly started to create my own content on the internet. So in 1998, I put up my own movie webpage. It was a Jackie Chan fan webpage. And if you might be wondering, is that like the best Photoshop of 1998? No, it is not, but it is the best that a high schooler in 1998 could do with Microsoft Paint. And on the webpage, there was a section where you could click on all the Jackie Chan's body parts and find out in which movie he injured that body part. And I ran it for about a year. It was a ton of fun, but like so many projects in my life, I did it for a little while, and I didn't stick with it long enough for it to take off. So I quit. And as a child, I wasn't really all that wild. I never drank alcohol when I was a teenager. In fact, the first time I ever drank alcohol was when I was 21 years old, and I'd intentionally avoided alcohol for the obvious reasons. But there was a day where my best friend, his brother, probably attempted suicide and was in a medically induced coma. And my friend came over to my house with some alcohol, looking to just escape the pain of the day. And he wanted me to drink with him. And I knew because of my family history, I knew because of my own personal tendencies, I probably shouldn't start down that path. But if ever there was like a good excuse, if ever there was a reason someone is in a coma, this is probably a good enough excuse. That lie, that way of thinking crept into my mind, and it had devastating consequences in my life over the next decade. And I'm not saying this is a general statement about other people and alcohol, but for me personally, in light of my family history, me personally, I knew I couldn't go down that path. And I opened that door. But for the next few years, life was actually really good. I met my wife, went to college, graduated from college, got a job at a church. And so life went great for about 5 years. And so things were healthy and kind of on the upswing. But when you work at a church, you know everyone. Well, if you're at a mega church, you probably don't know everyone. But at normal sized churches, you know everyone and you love everyone and you care about everyone and you know everything going on in their life. And so anytime something happens to anyone, that's a burden that you can carry. And I had that little lie in my head. It's okay if the day's bad enough. And in church world, there's a lot of days that go really bad because you care about so many people. And so I started drinking like once a month, once a week, a couple times per week, a little bit more, step by step, heading in a very dangerous direction. And I remember specifically in 2011, there was a day where we had a stressful day at church, went home, had a little bit to drink, unwind, and nothing that if any of you saw it, you wouldn't think like, dude, that guy's got a problem. You'd just be like, yeah, we just had a little bit to drink after a busy day. But for me, it was heading down a dangerous path. And I remember walking into my kitchen, and I wanted to have more to drink, and I knew my wife would think that was too much. So I opened the refrigerator door just in the right way so she couldn't see what I was doing, so I could sneak another drink. And in that moment, I actually had the thought, wait a minute, isn't that what alcoholics do? Like I saw the red flag in my mind, and I ignored it. I kept going down that path. And what I didn't realize is that I was right around the corner from just the worst, most tragic time period in my life. In December of 2013, a girl in the community where I was a pastor committed suicide. A few months later, one of my students that was in my small group committed suicide. There was just death after death in a very short window of time. And I had been living all the way up to the edge of what I could sustain without losing control. And I was dangling over the edge. There was no margin for if tragedy struck. But it wasn't a tragedy. It was tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And I was one step away from the edge, but it was step after step that just hit me. In a very short window of time, it went from, it's okay to drink because it was a bad day, to, I can't stop drinking. And I'd repeated the same pattern that had killed my father 10 years earlier. But I was a pastor, so I had this thought in my head of like, I don't even know what do I do? Where do I go for help? Because my job is kind of tied to my reputation. And so if I come clean, my life is over with. If anyone finds out what I've been up to, how do I support my family? Where do I go from here if anyone knows what I have been up to? And I just believed that more of these lines, like, if people find out, everything is over. So I better keep this secret. So for 3 years, I kept trying to fix myself in secret, doing everything I could to try and make it work. And for 3 months, through willpower, I could stop. That is not how you defeat addiction. And so when it came back at dangerous levels. And for 3 years I was just in chaos. And my son was born in 2012. My daughter was born in 2014. I barely remember the first few years of their life, and I don't really want to remember those years of my life because it was so painful in such a dark version of who I was. And in summer 2016, I reached the point where I went, I am tired of feeling this way. I'm tired of caring more about what people think about me than what's really going on, caring more about my reputation than my character, caring more about looking pure than being pure. I'm tired of being a terrible dad, husband, pastor, disciple. I need to do anything I can to get healthy. And so I went to the elder board at the church, confessed everything, turned in my resignation, just said, whatever you guys want me to do, I will do it. I just need to get healthy. And it's like the book of James says, God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. Even in session 1 today, like I had my notes, James was in there, and that's what Chris said. He's talking about the dangers of pride. That's my story. For years, I cared more about what people thought about me than what was really going on. That's pride. I thought I could fix myself. That's pride. God opposes the proud and he gives grace to the humble. And a humble person says, I care more about being pure than looking pure. I can't, but you can. So I went to the elder board and I said, whatever you want me to do, whatever you need me to do, I will do it. And it's a little rabbit trail that actually doesn't tie into where I'm going with my talk, but 6 years later, we're still at the same church. And I know so many people, they have stories of when moral failings happen, they're run off by the church. Not every church is like that. A few churches still actually do understand the gospel and grace. And so when everything went down, they poured out grace onto us to get me the recovery, the help that I needed. So 6 years later, we're still there. I'm actually doing an announcement at church this Sunday.
That's great.
But in 2016, I was unemployed. And I had no idea what was next. And so, a few weeks later, trying to rebuild my relationship with my wife, took her on a date night to go see Lady Ghostbusters, which if you're trying to rebuild trust with someone, that's not the best movie to take them to, but that was the movie that came out. And so we went to go see Lady Ghostbusters, and we actually have a picture of all of the pictures to take, of all the ways for this to go down. We went with the Snapchat filter that particular day. It's like, this date night changed the trajectory of our life. Ta-da! And the next day, I was unemployed. I had nothing better to do. What was my lifelong escape from the crazy of life? Talking movies on the internet. And I'd had blogs, I'd had web pages, I'd tried to start on YouTube before. And so I went back to that and posted my review of Ghostbusters. As I mentioned earlier, as James said, what makes you weird when you're a kid makes you great. That's kind of what my story looks like a little bit. But when you're starting out on YouTube, you don't make any money. So I needed a job, and I sent out my resume to as many places as I could to try and find something, and I didn't hear back from anyone except for a job delivering paint. And I went in, did an interview, walked in, bought new shoes, new suit, walked into a dirty office, was interviewed by a guy 8 years younger than me. He was covered in paint. Had to swallow a little bit of pride, and that was the job I could get. And it was literally a job I could get because I could pass a drug test, which is ironic because I was in rehab at the time at nighttime. And so for 2.5 years, I drove around Austin delivering paint. In fact, I delivered a lot of paint on this strip of 183 to facilities like this one, and I'm wondering what year this building was built because there's a chance that I delivered paint in joint compound to this exact facility. So 8 hours a day, I would deliver paint in the hot Texas sun, and then I'd go home, spend a few hours with my wife and kids until they went to bed. Then I would be up till late hours shooting, editing videos, and I lived off 3 hours of sleep and Red Bull, trying to grow this thing. A year in, I had 1,000 subscribers, which compared to every other project I'd ever had was a big, gigantic win, but it was only making about $11 per month. Excuse me, that's not true. I started a membership website, and my mother graciously joined as my one member, so with my adult allowance, I was making $21 per month from YouTube. But delivering paint doesn't pay a ton of money, so money you make from delivering paint plus $21 wasn't enough. So it's kind of at a phase of my life where it's like, I gotta do something else. And so I was strongly considering quitting YouTube because I just had to focus somewhere to make more money. And I started interviewing at churches again, including some prominent churches here in town, great churches, and it was a great process of doing the interviews. But I felt like that YouTube thing, there was something there. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna look back at every failure I've had for 20 years, every success, I'm gonna dig in deep and I'm gonna try and figure out this YouTube thing and how to make it work. And like had some of these real obvious thoughts like, okay, you do this type of video, you get 100 views. When you do this type of video, you get 500 views. Now, I'm not great with math, but 500 is more than 100. So what if I made this the focus and not this stuff over here? And then I went, okay, Sean, You would never watch any of your own videos. They're too long. What if you made them a length that you yourself would watch? I'm a thinking man. And so I apply this, and in November 2017, I have my first video really take off. Not Mr. Beast numbers, not Dude Perfect numbers. We're not talking millions of views or anything like that, but it was enough that it filled in the gap between paint job and what I needed to make to support my family. And even though I'd been interviewing at a great church here in town that I'm sure some of you actually attend, and it was a great process, I realized I was looking to go back into church world for money purposes, not because of a calling. That's a terrible reason to go into church world, and that'll get you messed up like I messed myself up before. So I went to my wife and I said, do you want me to go back to church world? She's like, no, I do not. Like, we still attend church, but there's a different thing when you're on staff at a church. It's a different beast. And so we committed to YouTube, and within a few months, I was making more money from YouTube than I was from delivering paint. Granted, once again, delivering paint doesn't pay a ton of money, but I was making more, and it meant there was hope there. And so I went to my wife and I said, okay, I screwed things up a few years back, really, really, really bad. What's every fear that you have about me going full-time with my dream of watching movies for a living? What's every fear you have about, what's everything that's gonna mess up your life if I do that? She's like, this is a long list. And I'm like, okay, this is my checklist. I gotta check all these off before I go full-time because I'm not messing you up again. I did that before. No bueno. And a year later, February 2019, I went full-time on YouTube, checked off the whole list, and it went great. I timed it for right when Avengers Endgame came out. As the biggest movie of all time, rode that wave for as long as I could. It was great for 9 months until 2020 hit. When you're a movie critic and no movies come out for a year, trouble. But remember what I just told you. I had my security blanket plan to make sure everything was safe. I thought it was for my wife. Apparently it was for COVID, and she was way more cautious about things than I was. So COVID was no problem because I had the wife plan in place. And so we're just a few months away from 4 years since I went full-time on YouTube. And like, I do something I love that I would and I did do for free, and I get paid to do it. And I get to pick up my kids from school each day. Actually, they're old enough now, they walk themselves home. I lost that, but I did. I got to pick them up every day and be there and be the father that in a lot of ways my dad really wasn't, which is great. And to put a final epilogue on this little tale, in May of 2019, just a few months after I went full-time, I was asked to speak at career day at my kid's school. YouTube's an interesting job. It's new. It didn't exist when I was in grade school or when you were in grade school. And likewise, every kid wants to be a YouTuber. So like, you get to speak to everyone. So I was like the keynote speaker for all the children. And so I walk into the lab where they heard me speaking, and I put my stuff down on a table. I looked at the table and I had a realization. I built that table. And I looked around the room and I built that shelf and I built that table over there and that shelf, and I built the desks in the room. See, I left out a little detail in my story. It was not too important, but in summer 2016, July, the same month I was in rehab, unemployed, started my YouTube channel, I did a couple weeks of day labor at a local school that was being built because it was the only work I could get. And so at the school my children eventually attend, I worked building the literal desks in their school and the shelves. And the last time I had been in that room was the lowest point of my life, where I thought everything was over with and all I have is building desks as a day laborer. I had no hope for anything better in the future. I thought my life was over with. And I was in that same room and I just had this realization, like I have a new career doing something I love that other people find interesting. I just had this thought like, wow, like I got a second chance. And as I look at a room this size, without question, there are people in this room that you are in the middle of your own struggle, your own addiction, whatever that is, where you know you've got something that you're keeping secret and you are afraid if it gets out, your life will be over. And I just had that thought, like if this ever gets out, everything's over. And there's people in this room that are in that spot. But that's the opposite of what's true. The truth was, I couldn't really start living until I got clean. There's nothing great about living with secrets and shame. To start living, you have to come clean. And that is where some of you are at, like just, I absolutely understand how painful it is and the cost. I would not ask anyone to go through what I went through back in 2016 and what I put my family and friends through. But I had to. And some people in this room, I'm sure you're just discouraged. You've had some project you've been working on, some passion that you just never have gotten the traction that you want, and you're thinking about throwing in the towel. I can't make any promises, but what I can tell you is that the thing that I failed at the most in my life, the thing that I failed at for the longest period of time in my life, is also where I found the greatest success. And when I was at my lowest point, when I had my biggest failure, that paved the way for greatness. So don't give up on yourself because of your past. Don't give up on yourself because you failed. Don't give up too soon. When I thought my life was over, greatness was just around the corner. Thank you.